This just might be my most ridiculous video yet. Welcome back to iRace's Garage. If you're new here, the focus of this channel is to go over some different budget guitar-based options to show that you don't have to spend a ton of money to have a great guitar. And a big part of that is DIY. Another part of that is comparing some of the more budget-based options to their more premium counterparts. And that's exactly what we're doing today. If you can't tell, I'm a big fan of Peter Green and Gary Moore and Kirk Hammett. And because of that, I've always wanted my own Greeny style guitar. Now I happen to have 3 of them across 3 different price ranges. And I wanted to go over all 3, not so much to focus in on the Greeny model specifically, but what I want to do is show you exactly what you get if you go to 3 very different price tiers for something like a Les Paul model. Starting here, we've got the Gibson Kirk Hammett Greeny Standard. We've got an Epiphone Les Paul Lazarus, which I've converted into a Greeny because at the time, Epiphone didn't offer a dedicated Greeny model. And on the end, I actually have a Chibson Greeny that I bought more recently. And we're looking at 3 very different price ranges here. We've got $3,200 for the Gibson. This Lazarus sold for about $900. And now the new Epiphone Greeny, which is essentially the same guitar, sells for about $1,400. And on the end, that Chibson was $260 shipped. So there's a huge disparity, more than 10 times the difference in price, ranging from the Gibson down to the Chibson. And I wanted to go through and show you exactly what kind of differences there are. In some cases, the differences are extreme, as you might expect. But in other cases, not so much. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that you should go buy a Chibson instead of a Gibson, because you shouldn't. If you've got the money for a Gibson, it's a great guitar. Not without its flaws, but it's a great guitar. What I think the Chibson shows, however, is that maybe Epiphone isn't the best value out there. We'll get to that in the end, but first I just want to take you through all 3. I'm going to go through my normal areas of comparison, and we're going to touch on what each one of these brings in those areas. So let's get started with that. The first area that I want to address is the cosmetic quality. And this isn't really a subjective sort of a thing. You could look at each one of these 3 and make your own conclusions about which one you think looks the best. What I'm trying to focus on, though, is the quality of those cosmetics. How good is the finish? How good does the binding look, etc. And we're going to start with the Gibson here. And overall, I think that the finish on this Gibson is exceptional, as it should be. It's not an inexpensive guitar. The Gibson has a satin nitro finish, and it's very well done. I don't see any flaws front or back in this finish. Now, that said, this finish may not be for everyone. Some of the things that I've noticed is that they don't seem to use a lot of pore filler on the neck, so you really feel the texture of the mahogany. And to be perfectly honest, I don't love that. I like a satin finish, especially on the neck, but I don't know that I really like feeling all of the wood grain. That said, a lot of people don't like the satin finish from a cosmetic perspective, but you can polish these up to some extent. Now, other cosmetic areas. On the Gibson, one of my biggest complaints with this guitar is that the binding work on it is fairly terrible, especially right up here as it meets the neck, and even on the neck itself. It's very uneven. It's got gouges in it. It was very poorly scraped. I wouldn't be surprised if it was done by somebody on their first day. And to be honest, I hope it was their last day. Now, moving over to the Epiphone. The Epiphone also has a satin finish, but on the Epiphone, it's a poly finish, not nitro. Now, just like the Gibson, I feel overall the finish quality on this guitar was extremely good. I couldn't find any flaws with the finish itself, both front and back. Subjectively, I don't like this opaque finish that's on the back. I feel like it really covers the wood grain, and I think it looks a little bit cheap. But again, that's very subjective. There's no real actual problems with it. Now you can feel that it's a little bit rough from that satin finish, and the neck was too, but I'll get to this when we get to the neck comparisons, but this finish does wear in very nicely and gives a really nice feel once it does. Now in terms of the binding work, unlike the Gibson, all of the binding on here feels great. The only real thing I could identify here is that there is a little bit of bleed where the binding was masked off when it was sprayed with the red paint. And you can see what looks like a little bit of a reveal from the maple top, but that's not really a flaw per se, that's just more of how it's manufactured. So overall, I feel like the finish quality and the cosmetics on the Epiphone are very good. Now that brings us to the Chibson, and unfortunately when I bought this they didn't have the non-relic model available, so I ended up buying the relic model. So this is tough to do an apples to apples comparison. I think overall, the relicing on the body and on the headstock, I actually think looks pretty good. Again, I'm not a real relic fan, but I think that the lacquer checking and some of the wear marks actually look decent. On the back, maybe not so much. This part here I think looks a little bit cheesy, but some of the actual dings and so forth I think actually look pretty good. Now, unlike the Gibson, this does have the grain filler, and even though this is a satin finish, it is very smooth and you don't feel the grain on the neck. I actually like that better than how the Gibson feels. Now, in terms of the overall finish quality on this leaves a lot to be desired. And again, I think this is more because it's the relic model. I've seen some of the non-relic ones, and they actually look very good. I would say they look as good as the Epiphones. On this relic one, because it wasn't wet sanded and buffed, you can see an unevenness to the finish, and you can just see a lot of spots, especially on the sides and back, where the finish sunk into the wood because it didn't have enough of the pore filler like it does on the neck. So overall, I would say this finish quality is not great, but that poor quality is largely masked by the fact that it's a relic model. Now, one other observation I had, and I'm kind of adding this into the cosmetic area and not when I get into the build quality, is the quality of this top. And I can see that this is a maple veneer, but I can't honestly tell if it's a real flame maple or if this was a sprayed on stripe to give it the appearance of flamed maple. Now, part of me wants to say that this was not sprayed on because you can still see some of that same differentiation where the finish is scraped away. But the reason I feel like maybe it is a painted on finish is because these stripes don't really move at all when you turn the guitar like you do with the other two. And it's very, very opaque looking in the darker areas. So honestly, I really am leaning toward this actually being a fake flamed finish and not a real one. It does appear to be a real maple top, however, because when you move it, you can see some of that chatoyance, but it doesn't do the usual dance like you would expect from the flame section. So I think the jury's out on that, but either way, I don't feel like it's an impressive top. So now let's talk about the quality of the nut. The nut has a huge impact on how well a guitar plays and how well it stays in tune. And how well that nut is cut is everything. You want these nut slots to be the right height, and you also want them to be cut nice and cleanly so that you don't get any binding of the string. Gibsons in particular are somewhat notorious for having poorly cut nuts, and especially your G and B strings will have a tendency to get caught and hang up. If you're tuning up the pitch and you hear that dreaded ping, that's a great indicator that your nut isn't as well cut as it should be. Also, you want to check how deep the nut slots are. To check how deep the nut slots are, what you want to do is hold at the first fret and you want to push down at the second fret and see how much of a gap there is at the first fret when you push it down. And on the Gibson, I think that these slots are cut too high. It's not as bad when we get to the high E side, and it's pretty progressive, but overall, these nut slots need to come down for it to be a really good player and to make sure that we have good intonation all the way up the neck. In terms of how well the slots were cut, they weren't bad. I don't think they were great. I did have a little bit of pinging on the G string, the B, and even the E. I just took a couple of quick swipes with my nut slot files and they work a whole lot better now. But I haven't done anything else to this guitar yet, and very soon I will be recutting those slots to bring them down where I think they should be. Quite playable out of the box, but definitely not a perfectly cut nut. Now, if we move over to the Epiphone, this one I've also done a little bit of cleanup with, but right out of the box I was really impressed at how well it seemed to be cut. It tuned up beautifully with no pinging, and the height on it is also a little on the high side, but it's not as high as we had with the Gibson. But just a beautifully cut nut other than the slots being a hair high. Never had tuning issues with this guitar whatsoever. Now, if we move over to the Chibson, believe it or not, this has a bone nut and it's actually really well cut. Just like the Epiphone, it tuned up very nice. I had an ever so slight amount of pinging on one or two of the strings, but not as bad as the Gibson. In terms of the height, this is the best of the three. Overall, really well cut nut. And I think at this price point, that's pretty impressive. So now that we're done cutting the nut, how about the fretboard and the frets themselves? Now the Gibson, right out of the box, I think had extremely nice fretwork. Now the frets aren't highly polished, but this does get a plec. Some seem to be done better than others. Mine, I feel, was done extremely well. I ran the fret rocker over it and there was absolutely no rock anywhere. The frets felt nice and smooth. They're not scratchy. And right out of the box, it was just a pleasure to play. Now the fretboard itself is a rosewood board, and I think it's got a really nice grain pattern. It's got a little bit of a red hue. Overall, I think it's a great looking board. Now I know some people with Gibsons have had tooling marks and other various issues that show perhaps less than optimal craftsmanship. On this one, I don't see any of that, which I think is great. My only real complaints with this neck are, like I said before, I don't necessarily prefer feeling the wood grain on the back of the neck. And my other complaint is that the fretboard is not rolled at all. This edge of the binding is really sharp, and it's not really a problem when you're playing it, but you do feel it. And again, on a guitar that costs north of $3,000, I really feel like this should be rolled just enough to take that edge off and make it more comfortable. Now, if we move over to the Epiphone, this one was a little bit of a different story. Now, on this one, the fretwork was less than perfect. Nothing that really affected playability. It doesn't have unlevel frets. They seem to all be really, really good. What I didn't like about this was that, one, they were not polished, and when I got it, they were pretty scratchy, enough that it had to be polished. The other thing that I didn't like about this was that you could see all the file marks in the ends of the frets. When they ran the file over the edge of the fretboard to put the angle into those frets, they used a file that was aggressive enough that it left tooling marks, and then they weren't polished out. And even when I polished this, I didn't completely get rid of them. I would have to go back and really do a lot more file work and more sanding and polishing work to get those out. And on a guitar that was just about $1,000, which is now about $1,400, I don't think that's acceptable. If they're trying to push these new Epiphones as a premium product, at minimum they should have premium fretwork. I've had a lot of other guitars in that price range and even below that don't have those sorts of issues with the frets. So that was a disappointment. Now for the fretboard itself, this is an Indian Laurel board and not a rosewood board. And a lot of people are really unhappy about that. They really feel like you should have rosewood on a guitar that costs this kind of money. I'm kind of on the fence about that. I do generally prefer rosewood. I think aesthetically it looks a little bit better. The big complaint with the Indian Laurel is that it's generally very light in color and also has a very, very dry appearance and texture. Now, that's easily rectified by treating the fretboard. This one has already been treated, though it's been probably almost 2 years since I've done it. And immediately upon treating it, it really did darken the board, and it also made it much smoother to the touch. And now if you look at it, it really isn't much lighter than the rosewood on the other guitars. and in terms of how it feels no different. This guitar has had enough play that I'm actually starting to polish in the fretboard in the areas where I play the most, and it's taken on a nice luster that really makes it look even more like rosewood. So although I do feel that maybe on a guitar in this price range, rosewood should be something that's offered, I don't really have any complaints about the laurel once you put the treatment on it to make it look better. Now, one last thing to mention about this Epiphone is that unlike the Gibson, this actually has a nicely rolled fretboard edge. The binding here is not sharp, and it's a lot more comfortable. Now, moving over to the Chibson. On a $260 guitar, I think I like this fretboard the best. This is a rosewood board, and I think it looks great. It's not quite as red looking as on the Gibson, and it's maybe a little bit darker than the laurel board on the Epiphone. The other nice thing about it is that it's really already got a nice high luster to it. It's not rough feeling, it feels very smooth, and it's nice and shiny. And I haven't treated this one yet either. So I've got no complaints at all with the fretboard on this. Now, in terms of the frets, I'm also thrilled with these. These frets came nicely polished with no scratchiness. The fret ends are beautifully dressed, they're not sharp, and there's no tooling marks on it. So these feel like they're a larger fret size than what's on the Epiphone or the Gibson. I think they're wider and taller, and overall I feel like they're really a joy to play. Now, one last thing on this is just like the Epiphone, the fretboard edges on this are nicely rolled. The binding's not sharp like the Gibson. So, buy a $3,000 Gibson and get a sharp fretboard, or buy a $250 cheap copy, and it feels great. So now let's talk about the initial setup. This is another area where I saw some variation. Right out of the box, I felt like this Gibson was completely playable, as you would expect. It came with the standard Gibson setup, which is set to about 3/64 on the high E side at the 12th fret and about 5/64 on the bass side at the 12th fret. That's not necessarily my preferred setup, but it came just as advertised. It had a little bit more relief in the neck than I necessarily prefer, but again, that's something that you're going to have variability. This thing was built in Nashville, and I'm up here in Vermont. It's winter, so there's going to be some differences. But overall, quite playable out of the box. It was well intonated, and not really much else to say. Now, the Epiphone was another story. Now, keep in mind, I've had this for a couple of years now. I don't remember what the action height was out of the box. I don't remember where the truss rod was. But I do remember that between the scratchy frets and the way it came set up out of the box, it wasn't really a joy to play at first. And it was also not intonated well, so I had to do the intonation. And on a cheap Epiphone, again, that's a thing that I think we can forgive. This is a premium level Epiphone, which now sells for $1,400. That it needs to play out of the box. There's just no reason for that not to have that attention to detail on a guitar in that price range. So now we move down to the Chibson, and this one right out of the box, it played awesome. Again, I don't remember what the string height was, but I think it was a little bit below 4/64. It felt great right out of the box. The truss rod needed a little bit of a tweak, but I had no fret buzz or rattles right out of the box. I don't remember the intonation being far off. Again, I can't say for certain, but if I did make adjustments to it, they were pretty small. And overall, surprisingly good setup on this guy right out of the box. So now let's talk about the electronics quality and the quality of the wiring. This is an area where you're going to see a little bit different results from what you've been seeing so far. On the Gibson, overall electrical component quality is every bit as good as you would expect from it. No complaints here about the quality of the wiring nor of the components used. It's got good quality pots. It's got a good quality Switchcraft switch as well as output jack, and no complaints whatsoever about the electronics on this one. One other thing about the Gibson is that the quality of these pickups is just phenomenal. These pickups are really the star of the show on this guitar. They're not a pickup that might necessarily appeal to somebody if you're just an everything on 10 sort of user. They are extremely bright, especially considering that these are wound relatively hot. but they're very, very bright. These are really a pickup that you need to use your volume and tone controls to get the most out of, especially in that out of phase middle position. But overall, once you find those sweet spots with your volume and tone, this thing is just wonderful, and I'm absolutely thrilled with how these sound. Now, the quality of the Epiphone. This is one of the premium Epiphones, not the mid-grade level stuff. And one of the big selling points when you get to these premium level Epiphones is that they come with much better electronic components. This came with CTS pots, it's got orange drop capacitors, it's got Switchcraft switch and output jack just like the Gibson. And all of those components are very good quality. The quality of the wire used, I don't think is necessarily as good as the Gibson, but it's good enough. It works great, and it even comes with the 50s wiring, which I think is great. The pickups that came with this Lazarus in particular are the Burstbucker 2 and 3 Gibson pickups. So you're also getting an American-made Gibson pickup with this guitar. Likewise, with the new Epiphone Greeny, you're getting the exact same American-made pickups as what came in the Gibson. Now, personally, I hated how the Burstbuckers sounded. I don't like darker sounding pickups. I'm much more of a brighter pickup sort of a person. And so I couldn't get those out of this fast enough. And I actually went with a very inexpensive set of Wilkinson WVC humbuckers. They're honestly one of my favorite humbuckers. And especially if you just leave everything on 10, they probably are my absolute favorite sounding humbucker. I had these in an old vintage V100 PGM, which was an import copy of a Peter Green guitar. I had it before any of these three, and it was my favorite guitar. The only thing I didn't like about it was the really thin neck. So when I bought this Epiphone to replace that guitar and ended up so disappointed with how these Burstbucker pickups sounded, I went right out and got the exact same set of pickups that were in that other guitar, got them set up. Once I got the pickup heights the same and I was confident that everything sounded the same, only then did I sell off that old guitar. But that said, pickups are a very subjective thing, and a lot of people really like those Burstbucker pickups, and they really are a premium option that comes on a guitar that I think is kind of a premium price tag for an imported guitar. But overall, I think the electronics quality on this is very good. So now we get to the Chibson, and this is definitely an area where this one can't hold a candle to the other two. The electronics quality on this guitar are exactly what you would expect on a $250 guitar. You've got dime-sized pots, you've got very cheap switch, very cheap output jack, and the pickups, although I think they sound good, they're a standard, relatively mild output ceramic humbucker. Definitely nothing special on these pickups. Although, again, I think they sound good, they're definitely not great. And one thing to point out is that I actually turned this one around. It didn't come this way, and they don't have the out-of-phase sound that you want from a Greeny. But again, I don't think anyone buys this guitar expecting it to sound like a better guitar. These are mod platforms. These are designed to look and play a certain way, but to make it sound the way you want, I think there is and should be an expectation that you'll be replacing the hardware. You're really buying the bones of this guitar and not the components. So I don't really think I should hold that against it, but if you're looking for a certain thing out of the box in terms of electronics quality, this isn't the one. So now I want to get into the overall construction quality, and I'm also going to touch on material quality and some of the hardware quality too. Some of this is stuff I've already mentioned, but some of it I haven't. So let's start with the Gibson. Overall, I'm really happy with the construction quality on this in general, but there are a couple of things that I'm not so happy about. One of which I already mentioned. The quality of the binding on the guitar in this upper horn area is really poor. The binding on the neck is really sharp, and the binding on the whole body is sharp. And this is really noticeable, especially right here where your forearm lays across it when you're playing. It's uncomfortable. And on a guitar that costs this much money, it's kind of disappointing. I really think that could have been done a little bit better. Another area that really disappointed me was this strap button right here. The first time I put a strap on it and I slung it over my shoulder, this button pulled right out of the guitar. And I'm damn lucky I caught it before the headstock hit the floor. Otherwise, I'd have a brand new busted guitar. That's just sloppy. There's no reason for that, especially on a guitar this expensive, but really no guitar should have that sort of sloppy craftsmanship. When somebody installed this, they had to know. You can tell when you strip out a screw, and they either didn't care or just tried to push it through. Either way, I consider that unacceptable. And frankly, the fact that Gibson uses a number 6 screw on this is also kind of foolish. Most of the imported stuff uses a much larger screw than a number 6. And there's no reason for Gibson not to use a better screw, longer and a larger thread pitch. I don't know, that's extremely disappointing. That aside, in terms of the overall construction quality, definitely no complaints here. You've got your solid maple cap, obviously with a nice flame maple in it, and it's a one-piece mahogany body, which I'm also really impressed with. I think it looks great, and I don't know what else you could ask for in that regard. And the overall weight on these can vary quite a bit. When I was shopping, I saw them up in the 11+ pound range. I saw them as low as slightly over 8 pounds. So there's a lot of variability. I had a limit of 9 pounds, and I was patient until I found the one with the top I wanted that was under 9 pounds. This one comes in just under 9 pounds. I think on my scale it actually measures right at 9 pounds. So I'm very happy there. Like I mentioned, it's got a nice looking rosewood board. And in terms of the hardware quality, it's exactly what you would expect from a Gibson. You've got your normal advanced plating bridge and tailpiece, which are decent quality. For the tuners, although most of the Gibsons come with the Kluson tuners, because this is the Greeny model, the original Greeny had Schaller tuners. This comes with Grovers, and honestly, they feel amazing. No complaints whatsoever, although I don't necessarily prefer them from an aesthetic standpoint. One last thing to note is that this guitar actually uses a short neck tenon, not the long neck tenon like some Les Pauls have. Some people say it affects the tone. I have no idea. I've never played the same guitar with a long tenon and a short tenon. And honestly, there are way too many other variables between any two guitars to isolate the tenon as a major contributor to the differences. So I don't know. But it's perfectly stable, and I'm absolutely thrilled with how the guitar sounds. So I don't care what the tenon length is. Now, moving on to the Epiphone. The Epiphone, just like the Gibson, does have a solid maple cap. However, it's a plain maple cap, and there's a veneer over it to give you the nice looking flame. In other areas, this does have the Indian Laurel fretboard, not the rosewood. For some people, that could be a big detractor. I'll be honest, I wish it had rosewood too, but I really can't complain about the Laurel fretboard. Once you treat it, it's fine. The rest of the build quality, I really like that this has got the rolled edges on the fretboard, and even along the rest of the binding, it's a little bit radiused so it doesn't bite into your arm like the Gibson does. Moving to the back of this. Now on the back you can see this is a two-piece body, which is part of the, I guess you could say, upgrade that you get with some of these better Epiphones now. Instead of having that cheesy veneer over a 200-piece body like they used to have, you're getting a decent two-piece body. That said, on this particular model, you can see it's a really opaque finish, and I think that allowed them to get away with using very mismatched pieces. If you look at this closely, you can tell that these two pieces of mahogany are very mismatched. That said, on the new Epiphone Greenies that I've seen, they do have a more transparent body that looks more like the Gibson, and from what I can see, the two-piece bodies seem like they match quite a bit better. Now, on the neck, this is a one-piece neck, which I think is kind of a neat feature too. There's no glue joint at the heel, and there's no scarf joint up at the headstock. Now, I'm not against scarf joints. They will actually make the headstock a little bit stronger, but this is a more, I guess, vintage correct approach, and it is one that adds cost to the manufacturing, so I think it's a welcome feature on a more expensive model. Now, in terms of the hardware quality, I had no complaints here either. I have swapped the original Epiphone bridge and tailpiece for some different hardware. I like the Gateau stuff. It's extremely inexpensive, and I feel like it's very good quality. My main reason for swapping was I wanted to go to the aluminum tailpiece just to save a little bit of weight, because this guitar does come in at about 9.5 pounds, which is a little bit on the heavy side as far as I like my Les Pauls to be. The tuners, these are the Epiphone branded Clouson style tuners, and I have no complaints with those. I feel like they work great. They feel really smooth. They hold tune well. No complaints whatsoever. So while we're at the back, one other complaint that I did have about this guitar is that somebody really screwed up when they were installing this switch cover. If you look underneath here, you can see a set of holes that were offset a little bit where they basically missed the edge that they needed to screw into. So they rotated this, they tried again, and they put the screws in at an angle to make sure it bit. You know, on a $200 guitar, I guess that's forgivable, but on a guitar that you're paying over $1,000 for, there's really no reason not to get that right the first time. So that was a little less than impressive, but I guess that's pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. So let's move over to the Chibson. Overall quality on this from a manufacturing standpoint, on the husk itself, I think is actually pretty good. I don't have any complaints about how the fitment of things are. The binding looks good. This does have a maple cap with a veneer over the top, just like the Epiphone does. And believe it or not, it's a one-piece body, just like the Gibson, and a one-piece neck, like the Gibson and the Epiphone. So the fact that this has a one-piece body on such a cheap guitar, I'm really impressed with, to be honest. And looking it over, I don't see anything to complain about with the quality of the wood itself. The weight of the guitar is actually fantastic. This comes in about 8.25 pounds. So it's the lightest of the three by a pretty good margin, and that really impresses me. Like I mentioned before, it does have a real rosewood board. The binding is nicely rolled on the fretboard. The binding is kind of sharp up here on the body itself. And the overall finish quality on this, like I mentioned before, I think is pretty substandard. That said, on the non-relic models, from what I've seen, it's better because those are wet sanded and polished, so you end up with a smooth finish. But this one, the lacquer has sunk into the finish in a few areas and is just relatively unsmooth because it's how it came out of the gun. That said, this is advertised as nitro. I don't know what formulation of nitro. I couldn't tell you. But in terms of how the neck feels, it feels pretty similar to the Epiphone, but it's not as smooth, presumably because it hasn't worn in yet. Like I mentioned before, this maple veneer is, I don't know, questionable. It's got to be a veneer because you can see it in the bare spots too, not just in the finish, but it just seems off. So I can't necessarily say that it's my favorite look. And I'm not really a huge fan of the relicing in general, but I think this kind of sells the relic look pretty well. Now, in terms of the cosmetics of the hardware, it's awful. These are standard chrome parts that have just been taken to a belt sander. It looks terrible. This pickup cover doesn't look awful. This one does because it's only scratched up here. It's still nice and shiny here. The tailpiece is kind of the same story. Most of it's still shiny except the one spot where they put it on the belt sander. And the tuners themselves, same story. They look really bad, and they're also terrible feeling. They're gritty, they're sloppy. They're really basically the lowest quality tuners money can buy. And I think the hardware in general is pretty low quality on this, although when it comes to the bridge and tailpiece, I've definitely seen worse on some of the early Fireflies. But again, like I said before, this guitar here is one that you usually buy with the intent of replacing most of these things anyway. It's really the husk that you want, and overall I feel like the husk is really well made. One last point is that this, just like the Gibson, is a short neck tenon. It's not the long tenon like you get in the Epiphone. But again, that really doesn't mean much to me. I'm not real concerned. One other thing I wanted to point out with this guitar too is that it does say Gibson on the headstock. I'm not a fan of that. I'm not trying to fool anybody. I did put a Chibson decal over it. One thing I do appreciate though is that there's no serial number or no made in the USA imprint on the back of the neck. So between that and a few other small details, I don't really think that there's ever any risk of this being passed off as a real Gibson, and in all honesty, I prefer that. All right, so that's my comparison between the three guitars, and I don't think it should come as a shock to anyone that I think there's a huge difference in overall quality from the Gibson down to the Chibson, as I think it should be. That said, the actual build quality of the husk on that Chibson honestly really surprised me. It was way better than I expected. I don't think you can count on every Chibson to be that way. There's a ton of them out there. They're all coming from different manufacturers, and you do really need to do your homework when you pick one if you're going that route. I went with a vendor that I did some research on. I watched some other reviews for, so I kind of knew what to expect, and overall, it still exceeded my expectations. I didn't expect it to play so well. I didn't expect it to be so well made. I did expect junk electronics and hardware, and I got that. So again, I really don't think that the Chibson is in any way taking away sales from the Gibson. If you aspire to own a Gibson, you're going to own a Gibson. This guitar has been a halo guitar for me for quite some time, especially the Greeny model. I've wanted one since well before Gibson even came out with it. That's why I bought the Lazarus and kind of turned it into one. So I'm thrilled to have this guitar. This is going to be a lifetime guitar for me, and from that perspective, it was definitely worth the money. Now, is it worth the money based on the build quality and what you get for that money? That's more debatable. It's a lot of money for a guitar that in many ways doesn't live up to the other two. That said, I think the real issue is whether the Epiphone, not only this Lazarus, but the new $1,400 Greenys and the $1,300 inspired by Gibson line, are those really worth the money? Again, that's a very debatable thing. You get some really good quality hardware with these guitars, and some of that hardware definitely adds to the cost. However, from a build quality perspective, I feel like they still leave a bit to be desired. When you're getting over $1,000 on an imported guitar, it damn well better be a great guitar right out of the box. And from what I've seen, not only on this particular guitar, but a lot of those new inspired by Gibson reviews that I've been seeing, they still have some of the build issues, though minor, they're still present. They come with unpolished frets, some fretwork that can be suspect. I don't know. I just feel like you should expect more when you're getting an imported guitar over $1,000. And I think the fact that this guitar comes in at well under a quarter of the price is testament to that. Now, I fully understand that the hardware quality on this is nowhere near what you're getting on these new Epiphones. But from an actual build quality perspective, this guitar at 1/5 the price is every bit as well made as this one. So even if you were to put much higher quality electronics and components into a guitar like this, it would still sell for considerably less than the Epiphone. But since these seem to be selling really well, the market has decided that these are a good value. I think what it boils down to is it's up to you to decide, is it a good value? For me, this is the one that's going to be going. I'm absolutely keeping the Gibson. Like I said, that's a lifetime guitar. But the Chibson, I think, is going to make a great mod platform, and I'm actually excited to start doing some upgrades on it. And so if that's something you're interested in, make sure you hang around, maybe consider subscribing. I will have more videos on this guitar as I do those upgrades. But overall, I think each one of these sits in a very different price range. I think they all appeal to different people. And I think the person who buys any of these three would be very happy with either of these three, so long as that their expectations are in line with each of these different tiers. So overall, each one of these guitars I really feel like appeals to a different type of person. There are going to be those folks who say that nothing but the Gibson is acceptable, the rest are junk. There's also going to be a whole lot of people that don't feel like the cost of the Gibson is justified, but they want the quality that comes with the Epiphone, and I can't argue with that either. And then there are those who are going to gravitate right toward either the Chibsons or the Harley Benton and the Firefly level of Les Paul guitars, and I really can't fault them either. Like I said, these really appeal to three different groups of people. I'm just weird in the sense that I like to dabble in all three of these ranges, and I think that's what keeps it fun. That's why I did this ridiculous comparison. I hope you guys learned something from it. No matter which one of these three ranges you might be considering, I hope that you learned a little bit about what you can expect from that particular range, and hopefully that helps you to make a better decision no matter which range you might be considering. Well, anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed this. This was a fun one for me. Like I said, I'm a big Greeny fanboy, so having 3 different ranges of Greenys, a lot of fun for me. If you're interested in seeing some of the upgrades I'm going to be doing to the Chibson, I hope you stick around and consider subscribing. Till then, guys, thanks.